Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone. Nice to be back in San Diego after quite a hiatus. I think 3 months or something like that, 3 or 4 months. I hope you all had a nice summer. I'll be talking today about the 3 gunas. We can translate gunas, I'll get to this in a second, but I like the translation energies, the 3 energies in spiritual life, a practical guide. What we'll find is that this doctrine of the 3 gunas, it's not just kind of ancient theory. It is an ancient theory that goes all the way back to Sankhya philosophy, well before Vedanta. Vedanta kind of took this Sankhya framework and made it its own. But it's intensely practical and incredibly useful in our daily lives. So that's the case I want to make today. And you'll find, so 2 of my favorite books, and I hope that there are 2 of your favorite books too, Bhagavad Gita and the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. They have many things in common. And one of the striking similarities, one of the striking commonalities between the Bhagavad Gita and the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is that both Krishna in the Gita and Sri Ramakrishna in the Gospel talk constantly about the 3 gunas. It's very interesting. And you might ask why. And I think the reason is because both of these wonderful scriptures don't just teach the highest philosophy, the highest spirituality, but they're intensely practical. And they come down to our level, they come down to earth. They take us where we are and hold us by the hand and help guide us to the highest spiritual goal. And the 3 gunas helps to do that. It really beautifully combines theory and practice in a way that I find very helpful. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So a few of the questions that I want to tackle. First of all, what are the 3 gunas, the 3 energies? What is the role of the 3 gunas in our spiritual life? And how do we apply this doctrine of the 3 gunas to our daily lives, every moment of our life? That's what I ultimately kind of want to move toward, actually. It's not just about what we do in the meditation room, but what do we do outside the meditation room? How do we enrich and deepen our spiritual lives by understanding better the workings of the 3 gunas in ourselves, in other people? All right, so first, the translation issue. So usually I find that the word guna in Sanskrit, it's translated as quality or qualities. I don't like this translation so much for different reasons, and I won't go into it, but I prefer the term energies. Gunas are energies. And there are 3 basic gunas. Many of you probably know this, but sattva, rajas, and tamas. And these 3 energies, depending on which one predominates in us, and none of us is purely sattvic or purely rajasic or purely tamasic, we're a mixture of all 3. But one predominates, typically. Depending on the one that predominates, you manifest certain qualities. Okay, so what are some of those qualities? What are some of the qualities of a sattvika person? Well, they tend to be humble. They tend to be unselfish. They tend to be compassionate. They tend to have a kind of natural spiritual inclinations. They tend not so much to project themselves and to brag. And people who are very rajasic are sort of the opposite in many ways. Not that they're bad, but just try to understand what are some of the qualities of rajasic people. They tend to be a little boastful, bragging about their own accomplishments. They're very particular about things like the clothes they wear and trying to attract attention to themselves. Even when they're doing spiritual practice, we'll see that in a bit, when Sri Ramakrishna talks about different kinds of bhakta, the rajasika bhakta and the sattvika bhakta. So you might think that doing spiritual practice is inherently spiritual. In a way, yes, but there are also different attitudes with which you can engage in spiritual practice. And if you're doing it to show off and impress others, that's the rajasic form of spiritual practice. Rajasic people also tend to be very ambitious. They tend to be full of desires, especially worldly desires. They tend to have very strong emotional attachments. Tamasika people, what are they like? They like to sleep a lot. They tend to procrastinate. When they have a deadline, they're almost habitually late. They tend to lose their temper quickly. This is also something true of, it's kind of a combination of rajas and tamas, but people who have difficulty controlling their emotions tend to be tamasic and rajasic as well. And in general, tamas it means darkness, literally, the Sanskrit word, etymologically. And so it also has these connotations of delusion, confusion. Some people just suffer from brain fog. That's also a symptom of tamas. Just like not having mental clarity about things, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. When you talk to other people, some people are so confusing when they talk that you don't know what they want. Another sign of tamas. Okay, the other thing is, the moment I've given versions of this talk before, the moment I talk about the three gunas, of course there'll be some people saying, but the goal of life is to transcend the three gunas. Why focus on the three gunas so much? The reason is this. The ego is deeply invested in making us think that we are far more spiritually advanced than we actually are. This is just a fact, a brute level fact about the nature of the ego in every single one of us. We love to flatter ourselves and to think that we're one step away from transcending the three gunas. It's nonsense. Sheer nonsense for 99.999% of people. The vast majority of spiritual aspirants, their first priority is to become as sattvic as possible. The goal is to transcend the three gunas, to attain liberation. These are very lofty words: God realization, liberation, illumination, enlightenment. That is the goal. I'm not denying it. But on a day-to-day level, on a day-to-day basis, the most practical thing to do is to try to become more sattvic. That's why it's so important. That's why it's so important to understand what the three gunas are, how they're working at the level of the body-mind complex, and how we can become more and more sattvic. Sri Ramakrishna says as much. One of his famous stories of the three robbers. He says there's a wealthy man, and three robbers pounce on him, take his money away. Three robbers obviously represent the three gunas, sattva, rajas, tamas. The tamasika robber, what does he suggest? He says, now that we've taken his money, we don't need him anymore, let's kill him. The rajasika robber says, whoa, let's not go that far. But just so that he doesn't run off to the cops, I'm modifying the story a little just to make it more modern. No cops in Sri Ramakrishna's version. He says, let's tie him up to a tree so that he can't run away and narc on us. All right, so the Rajasika robber ties him up to a tree. The Sattvika robber is just standing there watching. He's feeling very bad inside. He waits for the other two robbers to go away. He comes back to this poor man and he says, oh, I'm so sorry. I hope you're not hurt. And he very gently unbinds the ropes that are keeping him to the tree. And he says, please stand up, grabs him by the hand very gently and says, now go in this direction, follow this road and you'll get to where you need to go. And this person is so touched. He says, you've done so much for me, you're so kind, why don't you come with me? And then this third robber, representing Sattva, says, where you're going, I can't follow you. I can only take you this far. So that's what the role of Sattva Guna is in spiritual life. It makes you spiritual and it points you to the highest goal. And by the time you reach the point of becoming very, very sattvic, your own mind becomes your guru. And then you don't need to worry about what the next steps are because the mind is going to take you to the highest goal by God's grace. So keep this in mind, okay? Yes, God realization, illumination is the highest goal. But for us, our primary goal, our proximate goal, you can call it, the goal that's most relevant to us on a day-to-day basis is how do we become maximally sattvic in our day-to-day lives? Not just inside the meditation room, but outside the meditation room, okay? Sri Ramakrishna, if you doubt this and you're saying, well, where does Sri Ramakrishna say this? Let me quote from the Gospel, June 15th, 1884. He says the following: God cannot be realized without sattva, love, discrimination, discrimination in the good sense, discrimination between what's permanent and impermanent, what's real and unreal, kindness, and so on. It is the very nature of rajas to involve a person in many worldly activities. That is why rajas degenerates into tamas. Then he says, if a person is entangled in too many activities, he surely forgets God. He becomes more and more attached to lust and greed. There's a lot packed into this, and I think it's very helpful and very practical. One thing he's suggesting here, this is my interpretation of what he's saying. Two of the greatest hindrances in spiritual life, lust and anger, and greed, we can throw in the whole 6 enemies, we know that. 3 of the worst, kama, krodha, lobha, lust, anger, greed. Now, there are different ways of tackling these very difficult obstacles in our spiritual life. One is the head-on approach. Fight them directly. Often, when we try to do that, we fall flat on our face. Sometimes it's better to take a more indirect approach, especially with the strongest emotions and feelings, like lust and anger and greed. Sri Ramakrishna gives us a hint as to how we can do that. If we can make ourselves more sattvic, then those negative, unspiritual qualities like lust and greed and anger will kind of become less and less important and less strong automatically. We don't need to separately work to fight them head on, which could lead to disaster in any case. So by making ourselves more sattvic automatically, indirectly, but still automatically, without even our trying necessarily in this conscious way, things like lust and greed and anger will just diminish. Gita also says the same thing. Arjuna asks in chapter 3, Atakyena prayuktoyam papam chariti purusha anichanna vivashniya baladevanyujita. Arjuna asks, he says, even when I know what I ought to do, even when I know what's right, what is it that makes me do what's not right and to commit sin? He asks this question, as if by force. I don't want to do the bad thing, and yet I feel somehow compelled to do it. And then Sri Krishna gives a very interesting answer. Kama esha krodha esha rajoguna samudbhavaha mahashano mahapapma vidhenam ihavairinam. Kama esha, it is kama, lust, krodha esha, and anger, rajoguna samudbhavaha, both of which stem from rajoguna, rajas, the guna, the energy of rajas. Mahashano mahapapma, know lust and anger to be all devouring, all consuming. What does he mean by it? It's a beautiful metaphor, but what does he mean? It means these things are never satisfied. The more you feed it, the hungrier it becomes. Mahashano mahapama, and the source of all sin and evil. Vidhenam ihavairinam, know this to be your enemy in spiritual life, your greatest obstacles in spiritual life. So Krishna is doing the same thing as Sri Ramakrishna. He's hinting that the best way to tackle these enemies in spiritual life, lust and greed, is not necessarily the head-on approach, but to become more sattvic. Because both lust and greed are rooted in rajas. Become more sattvic, and lust and greed and anger are going to be, they're not going to disappear. They don't disappear until God realization, until illumination. But they become manageable. They become less, much easier to overcome and to manage in your day-to-day life. Okay, so next question. Why is it that understanding the workings of the 3 gunas is so helpful in our spiritual life? I hope I've already started to touch on it, but I want to just emphasize 2 things. Number 1, it helps us immensely in what I call brutally honest self-assessment. Brutally honest not just self-assessment, because as I said, the ego is deeply invested in flattering ourselves. Brutally honest self-assessment, painful self-assessment, which many of us do with, if you go to therapy or see a psychologist, or in intense prayer, you confess, to God, or if you're a Catholic or something, you go to confession and you talk to your priest. These are things that you don't like to admit to other people, ordinary people, but maybe to your loved ones. Maybe your loved ones will be people that might be able to help you in being very honest about your strengths and your weaknesses. Your guru, if you're initiated, your guru can help you. And God, go directly to God. In Hinduism, That's a wonderful thing. You don't have an intermediary necessarily. You can go straight to God. So even if you're not honest with most people, be honest with yourself. Try to be honest with your guru and with God and with your therapist. And the question is, with regard to brutally honest self-assessment, so ask yourself, which guna predominates in me? Am I primarily sattvic? Again, ego wants to say yes, but be honest. Are you really? Examine from the moment you wake up, even before you wake up, how long do you sleep? Then when you wake up, what do you do? What's the first thing you do? Examine everything you do in the course of 24 hours. Each one of those, you can ask, is that a sattvic activity? Is it a rajasic activity? Is it a tamasic activity? And as I said, it's not just that a certain activity is necessarily one of these three. You can be doing something what seems to be very wonderful, engaging in charity, working at a soup kitchen. You can be very tamasic about it. You can be very rajasic about it if you're doing it to show off. And the only reason you do it is to brag to your friends on the weekend. Hey, what'd you do this weekend? They'll say, oh, I went to a party. And you said, oh, I worked in the soup kitchen. Rajasic again. Easy. So, which guna predominates in us right now, today, at this very moment? And analyze every single activity you engage in the course of the day, using this three guna paradigm. And I'm going to try to help you to do this kind of classification with the help of the great teachings of the Bhagavad Gita and Sri Ramakrishna. So the first step, brutally honest self-assessment, understanding the workings of the three gunas in us, in our day-to-day life, in every one of our activities, helps us in this task of brutally honest self-assessment, which is the starting point of spiritual life. If you start with self-deception, if you start by convincing yourself that you're much more evolved than you really are, you're not going to make much progress, and you might even regress in spiritual life. So the gunas helps us to be brutally honest with ourselves. Second, what precise steps can we take to become more sattvic? Here again, understanding the workings of the three gunas really helps us because it's very concrete. What do I mean by that? These two great scriptures, and many other scriptures, but I want to focus on these two, the Bhagavad Gita and the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Both Krishna and Sri Ramakrishna take great pains to classify many different things, different activities, different kinds of human behavior in terms of the three gunas. Why? I'll give you some examples, especially chapter 17 and 18 of Bhagavad Gita. It classifies three types of faith, three types of food, three types of sacrifice, three types of austerity. Again, you might think austerity is inherently spiritual, it must be sattvic. Again, what's your inner attitude? Are you doing it for name and fame, to show off? Rajasic. Giving, charity, Gita itself, and we'll get to that if we have time, I hope we do, to distinguish three kinds of giving or charity. There's sattvika charity, rajasika charity, tamasika charity. Three kinds of knowledge, three kinds of work, three kinds of agent. I mean, there are three ways of engaging in action. Three kinds of doer, karta. Three kinds of intelligence. The Sanskrit word here is buddhi. Three kinds of perseverance. The Sanskrit word is dhriti. Three kinds of happiness. This is extremely important, so I will talk about this in more detail later. So that's just Gita, chapter 17 and 18. Sri Ramakrishna, he talks about three types of bhakti. We'll get to that very soon. Three kinds of work. He talks about three kinds of renunciation even. Talks about different kinds of even worldly people who are not necessarily spiritual aspirants. He classifies them in terms of the three gunas as well. Okay, so now, that's one thing. So we're going to look at how Bhagavan Krishna in the Gita and Sri Ramakrishna in the Gospel classify different human activities on the basis of these three gunas, these three energies. But we don't stop there. Another wonderful thing about the three gunas paradigm is that we can make it our own. It's not that there's this rigid framework that was left behind in the Gita and that we have to follow. No, it's 2023. We can adapt it and we can modernize it and we can apply it to things like social media, internet, pornography, this and that, and dating sites and a million things. There's rajas, there's tamas, there's sattva. So it's infinitely expandable, this framework of the three gunas. And we should try, once we get a hang of how to classify different activities, we can apply it to our daily lives. Okay? So let's begin with Sri Ramakrishna's classification of three kinds of bhakti. He says, the Rajasika Bhakta, and you'll probably know many of these people, people who engage in spiritual practices in a very showy way. Sri Ramakrishna, he was a great storyteller, so he would give very vivid details, and he would say, so this is the Rajasika Bhakta, devotee, is somebody who will wear a big japamala, a big necklace of rosary beads, and strewn with gems to attract even more attention, and he'll pray in public or meditate in front of many other people so that other people will praise him. That's the Rajasika Bhakta. What about the Sattvika Bhakta, the Sattvika spiritual aspect? He says, in the middle of the night, when everybody thinks that person is sleeping, that person is inside his or her mosquito net, because in India you need a mosquito net, too many mosquitoes. And almost all night that person is engaged in spiritual practice. Might wake up a little late. People might say he's lazy. Again, I'm embellishing. So in any case, he won't say a word. And he won't say a word to anybody that he was engaged in spiritual practice. They might even say, what's the deal? Why are you so lazy? Why do you sleep so much? Just Sattvika. Keep your spiritual practices to yourself. Don't trumpet your spiritual practices to the world. Another thing that I find quite commonly, after coming back from India, I lived in India for 13 years and I came back last August, I came to Hollywood. And I would give these lectures followed by Q&A, and to my surprise, one or two of the questions, almost always in these lectures, were not questions at all. They're bragging about their spiritual experiences. And in front of a room of people, and it just astonishes me. Even if you really had a spiritual experience, why is your first impulse to share it with the entire world? So anyway, that's an example, and I don't mean to pick on anyone, but be forewarned. And Sri Ramakrishna also says the Tamasika Bhakta. Who is that? This is very interesting. He throws a wrench into the typical idea that we have, the assumption we have, which is that, of course, Sattva is the best, Rajas is sort of second best, and Tamas is the worst, and it's to be avoided at all costs. That's true in general. There's one exception to that in the gospel, as far as I'm aware. If any of you are aware of other exceptions, please let me know in the Q&A. He says, the Tamasika Bhakta, what is it? Let me quote him directly. A person endowed with Tamasika Bhakti has burning faith. Such a devotee literally extorts boons from God, even as a robber falls upon a man and plunders his money. Bind, beat, kill, that is his way, the way of the dacoits. Now, Girish Ghosh, one of his great disciples, householder disciple, and brilliant, a genius. He is very smart, and so the moment Sri Ramakrishna says this, he says, it is you, sir, who teach us Tamasik Bhakti. And he himself, we see that if you read his biography, especially during his sadhana period, when he was desperately longing to realize Kali and she wouldn't reveal himself, he went to kill himself with the knife. That's Tamasika Bhakti. So this is the one exception as far as I'm aware, where Tamasika Bhakti is good. Sattvika Bhakti is, of course, very good. Rajasika Bhakti is the thing to be avoided. Don't show off to others. Don't talk about your spirit. I'm not saying never talk about your spiritual experiences. Talk about them in private with your guru or with God. Okay. Another big area of our life. We constantly interact with other people. Many of us have families, so you might have a spouse, you might have children, you go to work, you'll have co-workers, you have to deal with bosses, so on and so forth. Friends. How do you relate to them? What are your relationships like? How do you talk to other people? And again, Sri Ramakrishna gives us a clue here. One day, Mohimacharan, who was a very kind of learned householder devotee of Sri Ramakrishna, he read a lot of Advaita Vedanta. So he starts talking in a loud voice with somebody else and basically pontificating about Vedanta. And Sri Ramakrishna, he says, there, he is delivering himself. That is the characteristic of Rajas. It stimulates the desire to lecture and to show off one's scholarship. But Sattva makes one introspective. It makes one hide one's virtues. So notice how astute he was as a psychological observer. You can instantly understand. There's another nice incident when he's walking one day in Dokkineshwar, and the same person he's seen almost daily, this person suddenly talks to him in a different tone of voice. He says, hey, Brahman, how are you, how are you doing? Hey, Brahman, how are you doing? Shankar said, I can immediately tell from his voice, from his tone of voice, that he's come into money. He's become Rajasic. Even the tone, there's subtle things, subtle details about the tone of your voice in the way that you talk to other people, the way you treat other people, all of these things. If you're a really astute observer of other people's psychology, you can catch these things very quickly. I'll give you another example. I think this is a really interesting example. Look at how subtle he was as a psychologist, Sri Ramakrishna. He went to visit Keshav Sen toward the end of Keshav's life. We know that he passed away from something quite, I don't know if it was tuberculosis or something. In any case, somebody asks him, I hear you visited Keshav Sen. Sri Ramakrishna says, yes, how is he now? And the person says, he hasn't recovered to any extent from his illness. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, I found him to be very rajasic. I had to wait a long time before I could see him. December 17th, 1883. This is really interesting. I had to wait a long time before I could see him. Geshe told him to come at a certain time. Sri Ramakrishna came at that time because he always maintained honesty and truthfulness. And he's waiting, and he's waiting, and he's waiting. And he comes, I don't know, a half hour later or 45 minutes later. I've had this experience with several people in the past, especially VIPs, CEOs of companies, sometimes monastic orders. They make an appointment, and they love to make you wait because it enhances their importance. You see, if you don't wait, then you're not. Who are you? If you make them wait for 45 minutes and they just put in their time and without complaining, that means that you're really somebody. So again, you can categorize anything in terms of these three gunas. That's the point I'm trying to make. Now we come to a very controversial topic. I don't know if you can guess. Food. Controversial in our tradition especially. Controversial, confusing, bewildering sometimes. Okay, let's start with a simple quotation from Sri Ramakrishna. His beloved spiritual son, Rakhal, Brahmanandaji. He says one day, October 18th, 1885, Rakhal has indigestion. It is best to take only sattvic food. Haven't you read about it in the Gita? Don't you read the Gita? So he himself makes a connection, I'm glad. I'm thankful to Sri Ramakrishna for doing that. Don't you read the Gita? That means he's thinking of Bhagavad Gita, chapter 17, verses 8 through 10, which classifies different kinds of food. Now, one thing to keep in mind about these shlokas, these verses, is that Krishna does not actually classify different kinds of, he doesn't say that certain kinds of food are sattvic, other kinds of food are rajasic, and other kinds of food are tamasic. He says there are sattvika people who feel naturally drawn toward, they naturally like a certain type of food, and Krishna gives those the qualities of food that sattvika people like. And then he says rajasika people tend to like this kind of food. Tamasika people tend to like this kind of food. Okay, so what kind of food? Some of you who are staunch vegetarians may be disappointed to know that Krishna does not explicitly say sattvika food has to be vegetarian. It's just not there. What he says is the sattvic, but it gets more complicated. So I'm going to throw a dog to the vegetarian bones, or a vegetarian bone to the vegetarians as well. Okay, so hold on. Let me give you the translation first of the three verses. I don't have time to go through the Sanskrit. So, verse 8, the sattvic temperament in the mental and physical body turns naturally to the things that increase the life, which are very healthy, increase the inner and outer strength, nourish at once the mental, vital, and physical force, and increase the pleasure and satisfaction and happy condition of mind and life and body, all that is succulent and soft and firm and satisfying. This is mostly Sri Aurobindo's translation, by the way. But look at how general this is. It's not saying certain kinds of food, you have to be vegetarian, this and that. Verse 9, the rajasic temperament prefers naturally food that is violently sour, pungent, hot in the sense of spicy. Everyone knows people who love spicy food. Acrid, rough and strong and burning, the foods that increase ill health and the distempers of the mind and body. Some people, they like spicy food so much that until they start sweating, they're not satisfied. Verse 10, the tamasic temperament takes a perverse pleasure in cold, impure, stale, rotten, or tasteless food, or even accepts, like the animals, the remnants half eaten by others. Again, very general. One could argue that this includes all non-vegetarian food because you're eating dead animals. But again, that would need to be argued and it would be controversial. But I am reminded of, I was in Bilumut one day and it's very hot in the summers, of course, as you know. and they come one day with the people serving food with this giant bucket, and I could smell it from a mile away, the stench, and it's considered a delicacy by many Bengalis. It's called panta bhat, and it's, you take rice, you soak it overnight in water until it starts to ferment a little, and you eat it with chilies. Chilies means, what do you call chilies? And not jalapenos, but anyway, I think you say chilies. C-H-I-L-I-S. Yeah. Chili peppers, and yeah, not red flakes though. Those green lonka. Chilies. You say green chilies, red chilies. You have those. You have raw onion, and then you eat it. So it's both rajasic and tamasic at the same time. And the moment I smelled it, I said, "Oh my goodness!" But some people really love it. So anyway, all right. So one thing that you can look into when you're engaged in this brutally honest self-assessment is, what do I eat? What do I like to eat, first of all? That's the self-assessment phase. Then, how can I make my diet more sattvic? Okay. Now, regarding this very controversial topic of vegetarianism, let me just quote a couple things here. Don't shoot the messenger. Swami Medhananda, Practical Vedanta, Part 1. He says the following: I myself may not be a very strict vegetarian, but I understand the ideal. When I eat meat, I know it is wrong. Even if I am bound to eat it under certain circumstances, I know it is cruel. I must not drag my ideal down to the actual and apologize for my weak conduct in this way. The ideal is not to eat flesh, not to injure any being, for all animals are my brothers. Why does he bring this up? Because he's giving a wonderful lecture on practical Vedanta, which means practice Vedanta, the oneness, the teaching of the Vedantic teaching of oneness in your day-to-day life. And then he says, well, if I'm eating animals, how am I practicing oneness? Don't the animals have souls? It was in this context that he admits, I'm not always vegetarian, but I know that the ideal, especially for spiritual aspirants, is to be vegetarian. He says it elsewhere as well. Another direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Abhedananda ji. This is something that a devotee pointed me to, Kumara. Thank you, Kumara, by the way. He gave a lecture called Why a Hindu is a Vegetarian. It was delivered at the Vegetarian Society in New York on March 22nd, 1898. And he says the following: every kind of food which we take into our bodies produces changes in our system, both physical and mental. Those who have carefully examined the changes that are produced in their minds by meat diet and who have struggled for self-control will find it extremely difficult to govern animal passions, violent nature, and restless condition of mind without giving up animal food. So, I'm not going to go into too much more detail here. What's the takeaway here? It's the following. In general, in Vedanta, what the great saints and sages teach is it's preferable for spiritual aspirants to be vegetarian because it is a help in becoming more sattvic. But in our tradition especially, we are not so fanatical about vegetarianism, and we emphasize that it's an individual choice, and that each of you, again, as part of your brutally honest self-assessment, will have to ask yourself, first of all, how attached am I to food? If you're a non-vegetarian, is my meat eating or fish eating affecting my spiritual life adversely? And if you can very honestly say no, and you don't feel very attached to those things that you're eating, then we don't see a problem, I'm saying on behalf of our tradition, a problem with continuing to be non-vegetarian. The danger is to become overly fastidious about food, and especially judging others. It's very easy to go from 0 to 60 in this regard and become sanctimonious and judge other people for not being vegetarian. And so Sri Ramakrishna gives us a very useful corrective. He says the following, November 28th, 1884. Blessed is the person who feels longing for God, though he eats pork. But shame on him whose mind dwells on lust and greed, though he eats the purest food, boiled vegetables, rice, and ghee. So the aim is to think of the highest reality, God, or your own deepest Atman, as much as possible. If food helps you in that, and changing your dietary habits helps you in that, then by all means, change them. But be honest with yourself. Again, ego is deeply invested in self-deception, in this regard especially, because we all love our food. Okay, and you should ask yourself, as part of that self-assessment, do you live to eat or do you eat to live? And many other questions. Are the kinds of food I'm eating, are they affecting my spiritual life adversely? I told you I would get to different kinds of charity, so I will now. Bhagavad Gita chapter 17, verses 20 to 21. As I said, most people think, yeah, especially in the West, where, the moment somebody does something in charity, people automatically assume that person, he's a saint, he's an angel, or she, I wish I was like it. It's possible, they could very well be. But everything depends on the inner attitude with which you engage in charitable activities, okay? And all spiritual practice, actually. So what does the Gita say? Again, I don't have time to say the Sanskrit, so I'm just going to give the translation here. Verse 20, the sattvic way of giving is to do it for the sake of the giving and the beneficence out of compassion, and to one who does no benefit in return. You don't expect anything in return. And it is to bestow in the right conditions of time and place and on the right recipient, satpatra, which means who is worthy or to whom the gift can be really helpful. Every detail, every adjective, every descriptive here is very important for understanding what is really sattvika charity. Verse 21, the rajasika kind of charity is that which is done with unwillingness or violence to oneself, or with a personal and egoistic object, or in the hope of a return of some kind. It's what Swami Medhananda hated, and he used to call it sanctified shopkeeping. Sanctified shopkeeping. The word shopkeeping is one thing if you're honest about it, but sanctified shopkeeping is the worst because you're hypocrites. Verse 22, the tamasika kind of charity is offered with no consideration of the right conditions of time, place, and object. It is offered without regard for the feelings of the recipient and despised by that person, even in the acceptance. So notice there are a couple things here. Rajasika charity means you do it in a kind of egoistic way, and you're doing it in order to have other people praise you, for instance, and you expect something in return. That return could be from the person you're benefiting or you think you're benefiting. They should show gratitude, for instance. That's one example. But also, let's say I'm a billionaire and I give $10 million to some kind of charitable organization. Wonderful. Do I do it anonymously? That would be more sattvic. Or do I insist that there be a giant golden plaque emblazoned with my name on it, saying that so-and-so fellow has donated $5 million, and you name a building after me? Rajasika charity. Tamasika charity is very interesting. It's not enough to just give to people in need. To whom are you giving? Secondly, what are you giving to that person? And is that what you are giving the most beneficial to that person or not? Sometimes just throwing money at a cause is not the most helpful thing to do. Sometimes you need one-on-one you have to work with that person, understand what they're about, and then instead of giving them money, which they may use in the wrong way, maybe if they have an alcohol problem or a drug addiction, they might immediately run off and get drugs. If the problem is poverty, get them food, bring them cooked meals, right? Instead of just giving them money. That's another example. So just throwing money at a problem or as charity could be tamasic rather than sattvic. Sri Ramakrishna says the following in a similar manner. He says about karma yoga, right? He says to work in such a spirit of detachment is known as karma yoga, but it is very difficult. We are living in the Kali Yuga. That's the current age, when one easily becomes attached to one's actions because of body consciousness. You may think you are working in a detached spirit, but attachment creeps into the mind from nobody knows where. You may worship in the temple or arrange a grand religious festival or feed many poor and starving people. These are wonderful things, right? You may think you have done all this without hankering after the results, but unknown to yourself, the desire for name and fame has somehow crept into your mind. Complete detachment from the results of action is possible only for one who has seen God. He's setting a very high bar here, and he's saying that the only person who can do karma yoga perfectly, completely free from ego, is the person who has attained God realization, illumination, liberation. Where does that leave the rest of us? We might panic. And so, well, now, the thing is, here's the key. It's not an all or nothing thing. In spiritual life, it's about degrees. And during that self-assessment phase, and it's not like a one-time thing. You should keep kind of reassessing yourself on a regular basis. Check in with yourself and ask yourself, when I go to the soup kitchen, when I engage in my japa and meditation, my other spiritual practices, how much rajas sort of factors into that activity? How much sattva? And you might find it's not, I'm 100% rajasic. It's Well, yeah, there's, okay, look, mostly it's sattvic, except that there's kind of 20% rajas, or it could be the other way around. And so in spiritual life, it's incremental progress. That's what it's all about. Not just in this life, in the course of many lifetimes, right? To finish a 26.2-mile marathon, you have to go through every point one until you reach it. Every lifetime is like that point one. Aneka janma samsiddhastatoyati parangatim, says Bhagavan Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. Having attained perfection in the course of many lifetimes, you finally attain the spiritual goal. And so in the case of when you're evaluating yourself, don't beat yourself up. It's easy also to go to the other extreme. One extreme is flattering yourself out of self-deception because the ego wants to flatter yourself. The other is to beat yourself up, self-flagellation. I'm not worthy and I'm useless. That's also not helpful. There's a middle ground that I think is a more healthy position. And recognize where you stand and be aware that it's not an all or nothing. I'm 100% sattvic or 100% rajasic. I'm completely egoistic. No. And you might find that in one thing, like maybe in the way you're raising your children, you're incredibly selfless. And yet with your spouse, you become somehow like the worst tendencies come out. You become more rajasic, more tamasic. You might lose your temper with her or him. You might become very egoistic. Evaluate every single, it's not that you're always sattvic with everyone, right? It could be that you have a very sattvic relationship with one person and a very rajasic or tamasic relationship with someone else. Or it might be that with your spouse, for instance, most of the time you're sattvic, but then there's some times when you suddenly lose your temper, you become tamasic, you become rajasic. Again, you have to be honest with yourself and ask yourself that. But try to make some progress from a day-to-day basis. And don't think that it's all or nothing and that, you're hopeless. Another important classification we find in the Gita, 3 kinds of happiness. You find this in chapter 18, verses 37, 38, and 39. What is rajasika happiness? Let's start with that. Vishayendriya sanyogat yattadagre mritopamam pariname vishamiva tatsukham rajasam smritam. Any joy, any happiness that derives from the contact between sense organs and sense objects is a rajasika happiness. And what is a characteristic of all forms of rajasika happiness, which are sense pleasures basically? They are like nectar in the beginning, but they become like poison in the end. It's obviously a metaphor. Sri Aurobindo, he explains in his commentary on this verse in the Gita, he I think really nicely puts it this way. He says, he's explaining rajasika joy. He says, this rajasika joy is nectar to the lips at the first touch, but there is a secret poison in the bottom of the cup. And after it, the bitterness of disappointment, satiety, fatigue, revolt, disgust, sin, suffering, loss, transience. So that poison takes many different forms. That's part of why I like this statement from Sri Aurobindo. He's giving more concrete details of in what way does rajasika happiness turn into poison. Well, anytime we engage excessively in any form of instant gratification, we will pay in dividends in the form of suffering in the end. This is just a fact. And we're finding that in the extreme now, especially among teenagers and their use of social media. And many of you are parents and some of you have teenage kids and you're dealing with this. It's a very, very difficult issue because it's the first generation to be born into the internet and smartphones and social media, and they don't know anything but that. I grew up in the 80s and 90s where there was no internet, and so I can see the pre-internet and post-internet, and I can avoid the dangers, and I'm a monk, which helps. But with a lot of people, these kids, 11, 12-year-olds, with their smartphones, there's a whole book written called Dopamine Nation, and her name is Anna Lemke, Stanford psychologist. She says that in the past, the big problem with addiction was drug addictions, substance addictions, right? Alcohol, drugs. Now it's behavioral addictions. And she says a smartphone is like taking a 24/7 injection of heroin directly into the system because you're constantly getting these dopamine hits. Every time you get one of your tweets gets retweeted, every time you get a like on Instagram, every time you get a favorable comment on one of your beautiful half-naked photos, you get this burst of dopamine. And teens are falling into this whirlpool, and the studies have come out study after study is showing that the more people use social media, the more depressed they become, the more anxious they become. All of this is because the algorithms are extremely sophisticated at the basis of all these different kinds of social media. And they're oriented toward instant gratification. Give the consumer what they want, as much, just bombard them. The moment you like a certain video, you're going to get a million more like that. And it becomes this echo chamber. And you get sucked into this void of, I like this, and then you get, so you're literally becoming like a drug addict, but with respect to social media. In the end, it becomes poison. Okay, now, on a slightly cheerier note. So, sattvika happiness. Yattad agre vishamiva parinamim ritopamam. Tat sukham sattvikam proktam atma buddhi prasadajam. What is sattvika happiness by contrast with rajasika happiness? Any pleasure that in the beginning feels like poison. Oh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to get up and exercise. Or, oh man, I have to go to the shrine now and meditate. It's 5 a.m. But in the end, it becomes like nectar. Reverse of instant gratification. It's based on delayed gratification. It won't feel pleasant usually in the beginning, but ultimately becomes your greatest refuge. And you look forward to it in the end, when you become sufficiently sattvic. And there's another qualification, which I love. The Sanskrit here it's a bit intimidating, but let me try to parse it. Atma buddhi prasadajam. Okay. I especially like Sri Aurobindo's translation here. So jam means born, jap. Prasada, here, Aurobindo is translating this, I think, very nicely as the satisfaction. So any happiness, sattvika happiness, is happiness born of the satisfaction of Atma and Buddhi. He translates Buddhi here, I think, again, rightly, as the higher mind. There's a kind of lower mind, which is, as Sri Ramakrishna would say, the rascal ego, which is attached to lust and greed. And the higher mind, which is interested, which loves, higher art, beauty, spirituality, God, these kinds of things. Sattvika happiness is born from the higher mind and from the Atma, from the soul, the deeper soul within us, which is separate from the body-mind complex. This is extremely important because there's a qualitative difference between Rajasika happiness, which gratifies the body-mind and the ego, and Sattvika happiness, which pleases the deeper soul within us. And the whole aim in spiritual life is to realize our deeper nature as souls, as Atmans, separate from the body-mind complex. That's the deeper logic as to why we need to become more and more sattvic. The more sattvic we become, the more naturally we identify with the soul within, because we're engaging in activities that activate the soul, that gratify the soul, as opposed to the body-mind. What are some examples? An example of sattvika joy is a good one, spiritual practice, any kind of spiritual practice. In the beginning, well, okay, some of you are probably initiated. And if you have been initiated, it's not quite like poison in the beginning. It begins like nectar. It's what I call the spiritual honeymoon period. And it lasts, I don't know, either a couple of days or a couple of weeks. And you're like on cloud 9 and oh my goodness, I've already realized God. Sometimes there's self-deception. But ultimately you have to come down to earth. After that honeymoon period, what happens? Dryness, the japa, the meditation, the prayer becomes mechanical. You're just kind of going through the motions of following your guru's instructions. Poison. You're having trouble concentrating, getting up in the morning to do your daily spiritual practices. But if you persist and if you're sincere, and sincerity means not just doing it, but actually being mindful as you engage in spiritual practices and ask yourself, to what extent am I doing it mechanically? If you're doing it very mechanically, it's tamasic. If you're doing it not mechanic, or if you're falling asleep during the meditation, this is also, I've seen this many times during meditation, every couple of minutes, tamasic. If you're doing it very impressively without falling asleep, but kind of every once in a while looking to see whether other people are looking at you and looking how long you're meditating for, rajasic, ego's creeping into the meditation. Sattva, that's why Jesus said the same thing. He said, go to your room, shut the door behind you, and pray to God who is in secret, and he shall reward you. So that's the idea. Same thing as Sri Ramakrishna says, actually. All the great saints say the same thing. But we can go further, and we can, as I said, make the Three Gunas paradigm your own. How? You have a 1-hour commute. Many of us listen to music. What kind of music do you listen to? Is it tamasic? Is it, hopefully it's not tamasic, otherwise it might put you to sleep on the road. Often it's very rajasic. If it's pop music, most pop music tends to be rajasic. What do I mean by that? It's meant to gratify the ego. It has strong beats. It's extremely repetitive. The lyrics tend to be extremely worldly. You broke up with me, I broke up with you, I love you, why don't you love me? It's about 98% of pop songs. What about classical music? There are different kinds of classical music. I don't want to generalize because anybody who knows classical music will recognize that there's tamasic classical music. I'm not going to name names because that's not nice. But rajasic classical music, there's sattvic classical music. There's a whole genre of Western classical music called sacred classical music, almost all of which is highly sattvic. Just from listening to it, it elevates the mind. Just to give you examples, many of the great composers in the West were Christian of some stripe. So Bach was a Protestant and he composed beautiful Christian sacred music. He put the Mass to music. It was a Protestant Mass. Oh, actually, he did the Catholic Mass, even though he was Protestant. It's called Mass in B minor. Mozart did Mass in C minor. Beethoven has Missa Solemnis. Haydn's got a bunch of amazing masses like Nelson Mass. Palestrina is one of my favorites. A great Renaissance classical composer. He's done this. One of my favorite masses of Palestrina, which I recommend, is Missa Gabriel Archangelis. And my favorite contemporary composer, Arvo Pärt. He's an Estonian composer and a follower of the Eastern Orthodox tradition of Christianity. All of his music, after a certain time in his life, he was very rajasic at one point, and then he just suddenly had this spiritual awakening, and then his music just transformed. And he adopted what he called the Tintinnabuli style of music, and it's extremely sattvic. So anyway, if you find yourself listening to mostly the pop music and very rajasic stuff, I'm not saying stop, go cold turkey on that. You might like it too much, but replace it. Sometimes try to listen to more sattvic music. That's another example of how you can kind of make these tweaks to your daily life. So this knowing the three gunas can help you isolate, pinpoint the parts of your life, your daily life, that are kind of working at cross purposes with your spiritual life. That's the idea. It helps you to pinpoint these things. Because it's not that everything you do is sattvic or everything you're doing is rajasic or everything you're doing is tamasic. When you're doing meditation, you might really feel absorbed in God, and you might feel it's easy to concentrate and you have absolutely no desire to show off. You're in your room quietly, the rest of your family's sleeping. Wonderful. But the moment you get out, you start quarreling with your wife, kids, rajasic, tamasic, or with your coworkers or your boss, or you're constantly complaining. There's, among monks in Bengal, there's an expression, we abbreviate it to, in English, PNPC, Paro Ninda Paro Charcha, constantly backbiting and complaining about other people. You'll know some people who that's what they spend most of their time doing. This person's doing that, this person's doing that. Their whole mental energy is wasted in just thinking about how bad other people are. Very rajasic and tamasic to do that. What kind of movies do you watch? There are sattvika movies. There are rajasika movies, there are very tamasic movies, right? Movies that put you to sleep. Rajasika movies full of lust and greed. Hollywood, I live in Hollywood, so I know it well. But there are very sattvic films too. One I'd recommend, by a German filmmaker. He went to a French Christian monastery, which is famous for its austerities and for being basically silent all day. And he did this documentary. It took great difficulty. He had to wait years to get permission from the abbot of the monastery to even do the filming. And it's an almost 3-hour long silent film. It's a documentary where there's almost not a word spoken. And it's incredible. I mean, watching the film itself is a meditation. And there are other films like that. I recommend Ingmar Bergman, for instance, the great Swedish filmmaker, Wild Strawberries, Seven Seal, Winterlight, and many others. Tarkovsky has some incredible ones. The Sacrifice is one of many. So again, what kind of movies am I watching? What kind of music am I listening to? How do I behave with other people? All these things you have to ask yourself. And you can, the Three Gunas paradigm will help you to classify your daily activities and to help you make yourself more and more sattvic. Another thing you should ask, and this is a big problem throughout the world now, do you have any addictions? it might be that in other aspects of your life, you're behaving well with your wife and kids, you're fine at work, but you've got this addiction. What kind of addiction? It could be alcohol, could be some kind of drug. It could be a behavioral addiction, like addiction to social media, unhealthy, excessive use of social media. It could be pornography. That's another huge problem these days. All these different kinds of addictions. So you have to be honest with yourself. Am I addicted to anything? If I am, then that's highly rajasic and tamasic. Rajasic because it's a very strong attachment and desire, and you're stuck in this cycle of desire, instant gratification, more suffering, and depression. You get stuck in this vicious cycle. Rajasic, but it's also tamasic because it's a cycle, and because you go through the same thing again and again. This is the testimony of all addicts until they hit rock bottom. They know it's wrong, they know they shouldn't do it, but they do it again. Tamas. So try to break that addiction if you have an addiction of any kind. It could be cigarettes, something else. It could be an unhealthy codependence in a kind of relationship with somebody else. That's another kind of addiction. You're addicted to needing that other person. You need to break it. That kind of attachment is never healthy in spiritual life. It could be to your own spouse or your kids. That's also not healthy. That results in helicopter parenting. That results in husbands being terribly jealous of their wives and not giving them the freedom that they should have, so on and so forth. Okay, so let me just end on this note. Sri Aurobindo, he used to say, all life is yoga. Never make the mistake of thinking that I'm being spiritual when I'm in the meditation room and then I live my ordinary daily life when I'm out of the meditation room. No, every single thing you do can be spiritualized. Yat karoshi yadashnasi yadjuhoshi dadasi yat tapassi kaunteya tat kurushva madarpanam. Krishna says in the Gita, chapter 9, whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever austerities you perform, it literally encompassing everything. Yat karoshi is the first verb he uses. Whatever you do it for me, if you're devotional in temperament, but spiritualize it. So all of us together, let's try to spiritualize every activity in the course of our daily life. Thank you. Questions? Do we have a fan or something? Or no? Is it? I'm just getting hot, but anyway, okay.
I just want to say that.
Yeah.
If you want to know how we can adopt sattva or
Can you put the mic closer to your mouth? Yeah, thank you.
How we can adopt sattva or rajas or tamas, I think it boils down to a lot about what Jesus says. He says something similar. He says you reap what you sow. So those people sow in their heart love will reap it, and they'll be more sattvic. And the ones who sow in greed and lust and anger, that's what they'll...
You reap what you sow. Yeah. Well, that's true. Yeah.
So it depends on what you sow in your heart.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's what I again and again I was emphasizing the inner attitude with which you do things.
And then there was if you read the Gita, Arjuna was close friend of Sri Krishna. He asked him, what are the characteristics of someone who's gone beyond the gunas? And he said that type of person, Krishna answers, is equal in praise or blame.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Or
yeah.
whether he gets
happiness and sorrow. Yeah, that's right.
He doesn't care.
Right.
And he has no ego at all.
Yeah.
He couldn't care less if he gets respected or disrespected.
Yeah, right.
And gold and stones are one to him.
Right, sure.
He thinks that everything is neutral.
Yeah.
And he's neutral to everything in the whole world.
Yeah.
And isn't that like a stone? Like we have no feelings at all? We have
No, you're beyond. So, that's a good, nice question, actually. On the surface, one can easily confuse sattva with tamas. On the surface, they might appear identical. Somebody who is always sitting on their couch, that person can either be highly sattvic or highly tamasic. And you can't tell just externally necessarily. You could sometimes, if the person's just eating potato chips and watching football games. But sometimes you can't even tell from the outside. And so you have to ask yourself, is what I'm doing very tamasic or what I'm doing is very sattvic? If you're behaving like a stone, if you have no feelings, if you're below feeling and compassion, you're tamasic. If you've transcended ordinary human attachments and desires, then you're highly sattvic. And you go beyond sattva ultimately to transcend the three gunas.
That
Yeah.
type of person is like, he says, worthy of being in heaven, because he doesn't have any desire for revenge when he gets badly treated.
Right. You don't have to be in heaven. You can be a Jivan Mukta. He says you can get that in this life. There are great examples of that in Sri Ramakrishna's life, but also Babhari Baba, Swami Vivekananda would often tell the story of somebody who comes and steals his stuff and he runs after them. The thief is thinking that he's running to catch him. Instead, he's coming with more of his possession. He says, take this as well, O Lord. He sees the thief as God. You see. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. This sounds like it involves
a
certain amount of effort, and is it to realize one's temperamental mix.
Yeah.
And it's almost an endless cycle throughout your life. But
why cycle? In what sense cycle?
Cycle that we go through these gunas every day with one or another predominating.
Oh, I see.
So if you were to go into deep meditation, how does that alter the mix? Which is, if you're deep in meditation, let's say samadhi.
It makes you more sattvic. If you're in samadhi, it'll help you go beyond the gunas, but any kind of deep meditation is going to help you become more sattvic. That's certainly true. But you have to ask yourself, when I'm out of the meditation room, when I'm out of meditation, how sattvic am I? And you have to make sure you align the rest of your life with your spiritual practice. And if you find that it's only in meditation that I feel really good, and outside I'm really nasty to other people, you're probably deceiving yourself about how high quality your meditation is, or what kind of so-called spiritual experiences you had. Yeah.
There's also the issue of working through your karma.
Yeah.
And so sometimes those behaviors are necessary if you have to.
That's true.
Those tendencies.
No, that's true. But here's something that Brahmananda said, which I find very valuable in day-to-day spiritual life. He said, he doesn't give the example of three kinds of gunas, but he does categorize three kinds of people. He says, there's one type of person who's so spiritual that without having to undergo a worldly experience, him or herself, just observes other people undergoing that experience and learns from that other person's misery and says, whoa, okay, I don't need to go through that myself. That's why in this life we don't marry, probably in a previous life we did go through that. Next kind of person is a person who undergoes a very negative worldly experience once, twice, or three times, but ultimately learns from that experience and then knows better than to repeat it a fourth or fifth or sixth or a millionth time. And the third type, the worst type, the extremely worldly person, is the person who undergoes the same damn suffering again and again, but doesn't learn from it. It's highly tamasic, right? You can take the three gunas and kind of categorize Brahmananda's classification that way too. Somebody who doesn't learn from their experiences. And so the same thing applies to your question, which is, yeah, you might have to go through it once. Try not to go through it a million times. That's the mistake. If you're a sincere spiritual aspirant, try to learn from your experience as quickly as possible and make spiritual progress. Swami Vivekananda used to say, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. Try to be mindful in the midst of all your experiences. As you said, you all have to work out our karma. So yes, it might be that we were born with a certain strong addiction, possible. You might at one point have to hit rock bottom, possible. Try to come up from that rock bottom as quickly as you can by being mindful and by engaging in spiritual practices.
Also in Ayurvedic theory, there's Pitta, Kapha, and Vata. Yeah. Which, as far as I know, don't change as far as part of your personality profile. How do they relate to these? I wouldn't say that they don't change. I think that I because nothing is rigid and fixed in that way. That's the whole point of Ayurvedic food, for instance, Ayurvedic medicine. These are things that will help to regulate your system and to increase the thing that needs to be increased and diminish the thing that needs to be diminished. So everything is malleable in spiritual life, especially if you take the long view of many lifetimes, because it might be that we're predominantly one thing, like Rajasic or Pitta or something predominates in this life, but ultimately you want to get to a point where you're maximally spiritual. Are they related to the gunas?
That's a good question. I want to, if there's any Ayurveda expert, I know that there's one lady who...
So basically, I click that, what you're saying. So in Ayurveda, you have your natural predisposition,
right? Whether
you're Vata, Kapha, or Pitta, right? Now the idea is that basically, the more you become off-centered from your predisposition, the more you have to go back. So what I've looked at, sattva means you are aligned with who you are. You are a vata. So you're using your vata talents, your kapha talents, okay? When you're centered. Now, when you start to go off equilibrium, that can be more rajasic, and if you go really off, that's more tamasic. So the gunas come into play. Sattva is an equilibrium. Rajas, you're starting to align yourself disequilibrium. Tamas is further, much further from your equilibrium point. That's all.
That's really nice. Yeah. So it's not a one-to-one mapping of these three Ayurvedic terms with the three gunas, but equilibrium versus to what extent of disequilibrium you find yourself in. Yeah. Thank you, Manas.
Swami, there's a question from our audience.
Yeah.
Is it right to interpret karma yoga as delivered to three gunas?
That's exactly what Sri Ramakrishna is saying. And he says Rajasika Karma Yoga is engaging in any kind of charitable activity or selfless service, but with self in it, with ego in it, trying to show off, get name and fame, expecting something in return from the person you're supposedly benefiting. That's Rajasika. Sattvika giving, Sattvika Karma Yoga, is when you don't covet the fruits of what you're engaging in, where you do everything as a kind of worship and as an offering to God, if you believe in God. To give you a concrete example, imagine you're a surgeon and you have to do a life and death kind of surgery. Now, any good surgeon is going to want to do the surgery to the best of his or her ability. So just because you're doing karma yoga doesn't mean that you're indifferent to the work or that you kind of do it in a mediocre way. No, because Gita actually says the sattvika karta, the sattvika agent, is the one who is dhriti utsaha samanvitaha, fully endowed with dhriti, perseverance, and utsaha, enthusiasm. So it's not that you're doing something kind of only with half your mind or you're uninterested or indifferent. No. But let me give you the remaining characteristics of the sattvika doer. This is in chapter 18 of the Bhagavad Gita. Mukta sango nahambadi dhriti utsaha samanvitaha siddhya siddhyo nirvikaraha katta sattvika uchyate. Mukta sangaha, free from attachment to the work itself. It might be that the surgeon is desperately attached to the work, and so he can't be away from his surgery for even a day. Otherwise, he gets restless, and that's not good either. That's a kind of attachment. That's rajasic. Mukta sangaha, and attachment to the fruits of the work. If the surgeon does the surgery, hoping that his name is going to be emblazoned in the newspaper because he just saved this celebrity or whatever, and he's such a great surgeon, or so that he can get that coveted promotion that he's been wanting for several years, again, rajasic. That's an example. Mukta sangaha. Anahamvadi, devoid of egoism. How much ego is there in the work you're doing? Do I think I'm so great because I'm doing this life-saving surgery and that I'm better than that so-and-so surgeon? Why do people even bother to go to that surgeon? I'm much better than he is. Anahamvadi, dhriti utsahas manvita, I've already told you, full of perseverance and enthusiasm. And then siddhya siddhyo nirvikaraha. This relates to the question you had too. Being equal in success and failure. Now, this is important. Imagine the surgeon again. He's doing the surgery to the best of his ability. Whether he succeeds or fails in saving that patient's life, not up to him. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, God laughs twice. And one of the times he laughs is when a doctor says, I'll save you. Who is a doctor to save anyone? God alone can save or kill. And if it's in your karma to die, no doctor in the world will save you. And so that's a form of ego when a doctor says, I'll save you. No, equal in success and failure. Which means what? It means you do your work to the best of your ability. Now, imagine that the patient tragically dies. You're not going to feel good about it, but you are not going to kind of go into a tailspin of depression for three months as a result of that, because you left the results to God. Any other questions? Yeah, Gita, yeah.
Should I just say it?
Yes, you should. Oh, yeah, with the mic, yeah.
Oh, let me start with a little one. Is how do you spell sattvic, etc.? Is it K or a C at the end?
Yeah,
and
so,
is it okay
okay.
to do the C traditionally?
Yeah, so, well, traditionally, as soon as you add the adverb, that's what complicates it. From a scholarly standpoint, the correct way to write the Sanskrit term sattvika is Sattvika. And yeah, because it's Sanskrit, and so it's sattvika. Bengalis will say shatik, and then they won't say the last. Hindi speakers will say sattvika as well, with the A at the end. But if you're just casual or you're giving it the title of a talk for a spiritual talk or something, then you can do it with the C if you want. You can drop the A, it doesn't matter. But yeah, I'm a scholar, and so I try to transliterate properly. Yeah, K, yeah.
And as far as music goes, if one likes spiritual music, things that feel uplifting.
Yeah.
But I'm always saying I don't like sattvic music.
Yeah.
Because what people I've known call sattvic music always feels like a funeral drudge or elevator music to me.
But then that's probably tamasic music. Maybe those people are wrong. You're talking to the wrong people.
I mean,
Judge for yourself what's sattvic.
If it has lots of enthusiasm, it has upbeat,
Yeah.
makes you want to dance.
Right.
It's
Okay,
God.
thank you. This is good because I wanted to mention one thing. It's because primarily most of you are non-Indian. That's why I kind of emphasize Western classical music and sacred classical. But there are some Indians, and especially online, there might be Indians watching. And in other countries as well. There's wonderful devotional music in India. Look at the gospel on almost every page. Somebody singing a song, Shri Krishna is going into samadhi. Yeah, and the thing is, these are very upbeat songs, and they're very catchy, and they're not necessarily catchy, very profound spiritual lyrics, which even native Bengali speakers, these songs are in Bengali, they tell me, because I'm teaching a gospel class, and I sometimes ask native Bengali speakers, what does this word mean? They say, I don't know. It's very hard because it has such deep spiritual meaning, every word. So yes, listening to even like repetition of a single mantra, Hare Krishna, the Hare Krishna mantra, that itself, you might think it's tamasic, and it could be depending on your attitude, but it can also be very sattvic. It can elevate the mind. It can take you into a trance state. It can take you to the highest samadhi. Bhajans tend to be very popular. They use kind of more popular tunes, but with spiritual kind of themes and all about God and spirituality. And in that case, those are called bhajans, and those are also very helpful in spiritual life. So I like both kinds. But Western classical music is more like Indian classical music, because Indian classical music tends to be more sattvic. They use special instruments, and it's much less popular. Again, because most people are not sattvic, and they're not going to like. There's a reason why popular music is popular, because most people are rajasic and tamasic, especially rajasic. And so they feel drawn toward popular music, which has strong beats and repetitive and the kind of worldly lyrics that they can resonate with, because they just broke up with their girlfriend or whoever, and I need this song to get. And I'm not saying that's bad, but if you're a very sincere spiritual aspirant, that's not the end goal. You want to try to change your daily activities to become more sattvic. Thank you.